Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Hinckley Forum. My name is Maddie Hare, and I'm leading today's discussion. So, the Hinckley Institute of Politics is a nonpartisan institute at the University of Utah. The Hinckley provides an array of transformative experiences for students through internships, forums, and classes. Hinckley forums seek to foster public discourse and civil debate on the most current and pressing issues, bringing local, national, and international thought leaders together. We want to thank the Tanner Humanities Center for leadership in organizing Mr. Wallace Wells' visit to our campus. We also want to recognize the Sustainability Office as today's co-sponsor. Today's Hinckley Forum is a conversation with Mr. Davis Wallace Wells. Davis Wallace Wells is currently a columnist and staff writer at the New York Times, where he writes weekly newsletter on climate change, technology, and the future of our planet. He was previously the deputy editor at New York Magazine, where he wrote a column on climate change and where his viral cover story The Uninhabitable Earth, was met with widespread acclaim, paving the way for his book. Formerly the deputy editor of the Paris Review and the national fellow at the New American Foundation, he was the co-host of the podcast 2038, which interrogated predictions about the next 2 decades. Mr. Wallace Wells will be joined in the conversation by Chris Ingram, Associate Professor of Communication, faculty affiliate with the U's Global Climate Change and Sustainability Center, and the core faculty for Environmental Humanities graduate program. Please join me in welcoming our guests.
Well, hello.
Hey.
Dave and I had a chance to meet earlier today where he was kind enough to come visit a class I'm teaching in a communication department called Environmental Communication. And one of the things that we think about is how people can better communicate the pressing issues of our time relevant to environmental issues. And how can we find a better person to come visit the class and talk with you all about that than Mr. Wallace Wells here. So I wanted to kind of follow up on some of that conversation and introduce some themes that came up for me and other students of mine about the book by way of sort of having a conversation about some of those things. The first thing that struck me is a move you make really early on in the book, and you did it today in the Tanner lecture, where you were quick to point out that you are not an environmentalist, or you don't see yourself as an environmentalist, or never had, and you also say, I'm not a nature person. Yet here you are, having written one of the best-selling books of all time about the environment, and it's not that those two things can't be simultaneously true, but I wonder to what extent the decision to distance yourself from environmentalism and being a nature person was an intentional strategy, maybe perhaps to reach an audience, or something that you undertook intentionally?
Definitely intentional. But mostly I would say that the motivation was to be honest. I felt, some version of what I guess you could call like imposter syndrome. It's like, who am I writing about climate change? I've only just stumbled on this subject. People have devoted their lives to it. People have put themselves on the front line, gotten arrested, spent time in prison. This is a cause and really a crusade that many people are just much, much, much deeper in than I was when I first started writing about it. And I didn't want to pretend to be a different kind of a person than I was, or suggest that I was, had acquired some expertise that I hadn't acquired, either, in the form of research and reporting, or in the form of, lived experience and sort of internal commitment. So I wasn't, I didn't make that distinction and make that sort of disavowal in a way that was designed to reach a particular audience, but just to be clear and upfront about who I was and where I was coming to the subject from. But I do think that it had an impact on the way that people responded to me and responded to my work. Mostly, I guess that this is in a certain way, self-explanatory or something. But the success of the book and the fact that my writing on the subject has found an audience generally is, I think, in many ways a sign that there are people out there like me or like I was 5 years ago, aware, perhaps concerned, but not yet possessed of a coherent, comprehensive sense of the scale of the challenge and the urgency of the crisis. And on this particular point, who may not themselves have spent a long time in or around environmentalism and environmentalists. And, I think I've sort of found a connection there by speaking as I would have spoken to myself 5 years before, not putting on a show, not pretending to be something that I'm not, but speaking to those people, knowing that they are waking up in the same way that I was, and trying to communicate as best as I can with whatever platform I have, that this is an issue that's so large, we sort of need to recruit people from all corners, and it needn't be a barrier to your concern or indeed your activism if you're just waking up to the problem now. There's a little bit of like a self-serving message there too, because I'm telling myself it's okay for me to be in this position, but I also think more broadly, more generally, and more strategically, there's value in it too. I think we can't hold one another to the standards of martyrs or saints and demand that everybody who expresses concern for climate have demonstrated over decades that commitment, or even that they demonstrate in their daily activity now that commitment. I think we have to say, if you're worried, like, let's be worried together. Let's do something about it, no matter where you're coming from or who you are. And I think I was maybe especially successful in communicating that because I was one of those people not that long before I wrote those words.
Yeah, I think I appreciate that answer so much, because your honesty comes through, your sort of authenticity is a better word for it, comes through in the book throughout the experience of spending time with it. The book has had an incredible audience, and perhaps bigger than maybe you originally anticipated. One audience that you may not have anticipated that was a revelation to me is that there's a young adult version of this book. I was wondering if maybe you could speak to how that came about, or some of the considerations that differed when writing for that audience relative to this, because it's such a heavy subject in many ways.
Yeah, I mean, one of the incredibly humbling things about working on this subject and doing it in a relatively high-profile way is that you meet and hear from many people who have had their lives affected, and in certain cases rerouted by their encounter with that book and my writing, particularly towards climate action of one kind or another, either sort of professional or on a sort of political activism side. And many of those people that I've met over the years were quite young, teenagers or in their early 20s. And in certain ways, it's again, I feel like, who am I to have shaped someone's life, changed someone's life? It just seems so. I'm glad to have done it. I think the climate crisis is a very real and pressing issue. But I also, again, as I was saying in response to your first question, just wanted to be really clear about who I was and where I was coming from, and not sort of overstep my bounds. And in thinking about that relationship, I often think about something my father-in-law said to me when the book came out, when he said, you've written a really good book, but your timing was perfect. And I think ultimately that's a big part of this story too. And in thinking about how I can serve those people, how I might serve future people like them, how I can be clear about who I am and what I've done and where I'm coming from, but also do what I can to have, to sort of cultivate the biggest response and take seriously the moment that I found myself kind of accidentally a part of. I thought, we should do something that's more targeted at young people, and especially people who are really coming to this subject for the first time. How I retooled and recalibrated the text itself, I did that mostly by downsizing and streamlining. But I also rewrote pretty substantially the sort of opening riff of the book. And I did that pointing it in a less bleak direction. Not because I didn't think a 15-year-old could handle the truth, but simply because between the time I wrote the book and the time I was working on the young adult version, which was not that long ago, I did think that, our baseline of expectation had changed, and it was misleading to kind of double down on what had seemed so dark about the future of the world a few years before. And again, that the only honest way was to write anew my own perspective on what we knew about what was coming. And that meant changing, the first line of the book from it is worse, much worse than you think, to I think it's the world will be what we make it. And if I were writing the grown-up version again, I would do the same change. It was less about the age of the readers than about my own perspective shifting. But I think all along it's been important to me, perhaps because I still think of myself as a kind of a newbie. It's been important to me to be really honest about the way that my own perspective is changing, and to be honest about marking changes in the news as well. And I've written a number of pieces, over the last couple of years that were explicitly about that. If I was here in 2017 and here in 2019, here I am on the spectrum in 2021, here I am on the spectrum in 2023. And that may be, more of service, like psychological service to myself than to readers, but I think just as a matter of basic honesty and integrity, we should acknowledge when our perspective changes, and that's sort of what's reflected most clearly, I think, in the young adult edition.
Yeah, thank you. I think one of the things that I really enjoy about reading your writing, and I try to follow the stuff with the Times too, is that you are hesitant to offer the final word or simplifications of a situation that's really complex and dynamic. And you show a willingness to adjust to new information and assimilate that into your thinking, and then make new assessments, which themselves are provisional and contingent on things that are happening in sort of cascades, as you put it, beyond our ability to comprehend in full. And you also manage to achieve a fair amount of integrity with your journalistic neutrality. At the same time, there are some moments in the book where some of the personal parts creep out, and it lends a little color and personality and investment in the reading. But I wanted to ask you maybe a little harder question about one of those moments. It's in the same spot early on in the book where you say you're not an environmentalist or a nature person. And I'm going to read this so I get it right, because I'm going to quote you here. You write, I tend to think when you're on top of the food chain, it's okay to flaunt it, because I don't see anything complicated about drawing a moral boundary between us and other animals. And in fact, find it offensive to women and people of color that all of a sudden there's talk of extending human rights like legal protections to chimps, apes, and octopuses just a generation or two after we finally broke the white male monopoly on legal personhood. On one hand, yes, that we absolutely need to be protecting the rights and equality and equity of human people that have long been marginalized, and new communities that are being marginalized for various reasons. At the same time, I find that it's harder for me and other environmentalists I know, including many of my students, to draw a pretty clear moral divide between humans and other living things. So I guess I want to know if in your research you found any indications that sort of the hubris of humankind, the kind that we see in the great myths and epics, is partly responsible for the situation we're in. I guess I can phrase that. You can see this as another question or an extension of that, a rephrasing of that one. I'm asking if this idea that human intelligence or power makes us privileged actors over other planetary cohabitants is actually sustainable at a time when, as I think your book shows, it's clearer than ever that humans need the other living things on the planet far more than they need us.
Well, I think the question you ask is a very sharp one, and I think it's sort of undeniable that I jokingly called last night, like human chauvinism is a contributor to the climate crisis and the ecological crisis, that our belief that we exert dominion over the natural world and are totally in control of it and use it for our purposes without much regard for its own design, all of that is viewed from the perspective of the climate crisis, a cultural sickness that has made our behavior considerably more destructive and ultimately self-destructive than it would be otherwise, and that having a healthier, more balanced relationship with the natural world and all the creatures that we share it with would be, a step out of sickness into healthiness. That all said, I don't want us to go all the way to a place where we think that humans are just another species on the planet. We have transformed the world already, and there's a version of the if you broke it, you bought it kind of principle at work here. I think the figure is that 4% of mammal biomass now is wild, and 96% is humans and their livestock. Huge, if not, the lion's share of the world's surface has been transformed by human activity. Urbanization, the development of agriculture, these are, planet-straddling transformations that we have unleashed, and we need to take responsibility for that as we take responsibility for the climate crisis. And I think doing that to some degree, by some vantage, requires a sense of ownership and authority. And I do think that that's earned. I think that we are more powerful actors on this stage than the other species that we share the planet with, and we shouldn't hide from that. In fact, we can, in theory, be more responsible the more that we embrace that power, so long as we also take seriously our own limitations and the pathologies of of that chauvinism. So, it's a sort of a both yes and kind of response. I mean, I think absolutely looking back, we have fucked things up. And one major reason for that is that we thought we were entitled to it all. Going forward, I think we need to take responsibility. And for me, that means taking seriously our power and our exceptional place in the world's ecosystems, even as we take seriously, how much those other species, and to some extent also those other cultures, since I think we're also talking about cultural specific pathologies, have to teach us about better ways of being.
Yeah, so thank you for that. Let me follow up on the cultural ways of being, because one thing I'm seeing across the U and in my classes in communication and environmental humanities, and really just across academia in general, but across the popular imaginary too, is renewed attention or new attention to indigenous sovereignty, indigenous rights, traditional ecological knowledge, and a lot of sort of ways of imagining the human relationship with the planet and all the other living things on it from these more traditional perspectives that predate settler colonialism and times of rapid growth and capitalism and industrialism. And I noticed that your work tends to be routed through cutting edge science that's absolutely essential. At the same time, I'm curious what place you see some of these traditional ecological forms of knowledge playing in the work that you might do, or in ways to sort of resolve this situation we're in.
Yeah, I think there are a number of different levels at which to answer the question or to try to apply some of that wisdom. I guess I think of it it's most front of mind to me, thinking about the problem of wildfire, since I spent a lot of the last 6 months working on wildfire and thinking about the place we're in the world's wildfire hotspots, which is not just the Western U.S., but Western Canada, Siberia, and Australia. Those are kind of like the major locations. And in many of those places, we spent a lot of the last century blocking indigenous fire practices, even making them illegal, such that combined with other fire suppression and forest management policies led to large buildup of fuel, which now makes, along with climate factors, the fires that we're seeing in places like the West considerably worse. And there's a lot of back and forth and debate about exactly which factor is contributing predominantly and how to balance these things in assessing why we are where we are with fire. Personally, these days, I think I would attribute more to climate factors and less to the management of the land, but it's undeniable that there's some contribution coming from the way that we've treated the land, and that we've suffered from basically replacing a indigenous perspective dominated by a kind of a sense of symbiosis with the landscape, a natural balance with the landscape. We've replaced that with a much more Western domineering perspective in which we can snuff out all fire, we can control the forests, we don't have to deal with this, we can conquer this problem as opposed to managing it and living with it. And I think that perspective has proven not just wrong, but kind of disastrously costly. Of course, there are a lot of other ways of learning about how to live in concert with the natural world beyond fire management and forest policy, especially agricultural practices. You can sort of go on down the line. But in the really big picture, I think that many of those pieces of wisdom are helpful sort of secondarily or as tertiary interventions, because I think the main thing that's disrupting our planet's climate is just simply the burning of fossil fuels. And that we can manage our relationship to the land, we can manage our relationship to agriculture in much healthier ways. But if we don't get a handle on how much coal, oil, and gas we're burning, the changes that we can make in those other areas are going to be overwhelmed by the transformations of the world's climate through the burning of fossil fuels. And so when I think about how to integrate or apply knowledge and perspective from various, various places, various sources, I still orient it around a sun of we got to end the use of fossil fuels, and all this other stuff is helpful, but it's not another sun. It's like other planets around the sun.
That's helpful to think about that. There's this primary problem. We deal with that. The other little pieces can fall in place thereafter.
And I don't mean to say I did kind of say little, but it's not that they're not significant. It's just that the problem of fossil fuels is so giant and overwhelming that it really does demand preeminent attention, I think.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to go to the concept of uncertainty. You talked about this in your Tanner lecture today. You not allude to it, it's a theme of the book. And so one argument that you seem to be making is that we are not just in the past and today, but kind of continually facing uncertainty about what our future will look like. I mean, that's the nature of the future, right? You don't know what it's going to be. You can have some ideas, and you can have this sort of range of confidence. Like if you look at the IPCC reports, they give a quantitative measure of how confident they are on the claims that they're making, and that sort of thing. So we can pay attention to that range. And you suggest that the scientific consensus is there. The lack of certainty is the human side. It's the question of what humans are going to do. And this is a lovely moment in the book for me where it kind of crystallizes the hopefulness at the heart of the project, which says, look, we got us into this sort of, we can get us out of it, but we better get going on this. If we drag our feet, it's not going to happen. So this reminded me kind of this emphasis on humanity as part of the solution, as perhaps the solution. And it made me think about not just the sciences, which you so brilliantly vivify for us in a way that we can make sense of these really complex and abstract numbers and comparative figures. So I wanted to ask you if you could share your thoughts on the role of the humanities and arts in the issues you're talking about. Because you talk about it some in the storytelling part of the book near the end. But I think for most people, and you've mentioned this before too, we experience climate issues at the level of our body and at the level of our feelings. It feels awfully hot today. Well, weather's not the same as climate, these sorts of things. Or it sure seems like there's a lot of extreme weather events going on, and we develop a sense, and that can change from day to day. But reading stories, having philosophers teach us about some of these things, or present different ways of understanding it and feeling about it and looking at things. Even music, art. I know like at the COP events, there's always an art expo. So the realm of the aesthetic is a valuable and important way to help us make sense of this, but also perhaps to help us mitigate some of the problems that we're facing. I wonder if you could talk about sort of what roles you see that the arts or humanities in general playing as a sort of complement, a necessary complement to a scientific piece.
Yeah, I mean, I think, a few years ago, maybe even when I was writing the book, it felt enough like climate science was telling us about the future, that we could compartmentalize the questions posed by the humanities about political science and the economics of climate change, not to mention the emotional, psychological effects. We could sort of like quarantine them and say, let's just look at the science. And I think now that we're moving into a world where we are seeing unmistakably the effects of climate-powered extreme weather and seeing real disruptions to the way that people live all around the world all year round, I think some of those other questions are getting a lot harder to ignore. And I do think that we are entering into a phase in which we are going to be asking ourselves many more of those kinds of questions than we are asking the scientific questions, which is to say, like, if we are thinking about or taking stock in the aftermath of, say, a massive flooding event, whether it was a 1 in 200 year event or a 1 in 700 year event may not be all that relevant to the lives of people involved. The questions they're going to be asking are about how we looked after one another during the disaster, whether our community was supportive, whether people were self-interested or community-minded in their response, what role the government played both at the long-term planning level, at the disaster emergency response level, and then in the aftermath, what we can do to help one another recover from the damage that we've all lived through, and what meaning we make of the experience that we just had. And these are not scientific questions. Now they come from and draw on a variety of different disciplines. It's not like, these things, they have to do with hugely divergent traditions in human knowledge. But I think that we're beginning to live in a world in which those things, even when we're thinking about climate, loom larger than the scientific questions. And we're just sort of getting started reckoning with that as a culture. The arts in particular, I feel very much like we're at the germinal stage of a cultural period or cultural epoch that is much more full of climate reckoning and reflection than the one that we've lived through to this point. And I don't myself know exactly what sense to make or story to tell about those developments. I do see much more climate like plot points appearing in television shows and movies and novels. It is a much larger part of the way that people talk about the health of the world more generally. you read stories about people talking about climate in their therapy sessions much more. I'm not sure how much that's like climate bullying its way into people's psyches and how much it's that climate has become a way for us generally to talk about the sickness of the world. It's probably to some degree both. But I do think, to your animating question, that all of these things are profound questions that the humanities have always asked. Who are we? Why are we here? What's our relationship to the world we live in and the people we share it with? And that climate change, in shaking the foundation of our civilization and our planet, is asking us, all of us, to think about our priorities, our values, and what kind of future we want to build for one another, which is a series of questions that has political valences, but also cultural valences, also personal, emotional, family valences, and they're all relevant. So, aside from saying I think it's a very big arena, and that we're going to be talking about climate in those terms more and more, I think it's mostly I'm watching with interest without feeling myself like I know with confidence the way that the way those questions will be answered.
Do you consider yourself, like you've written this book that's very readable, it's had a big impact, it's immaculately researched, it's really thoroughly cited and impressive. What role do you see you playing in that? In the side of you're doing the humanist work of telling a human story. At the same time, you're doing scientific work. How do you see that relationship playing out?
Well, in the big picture, I guess I would say that one thing that has, I think, distinguished a lot of my work is that I do see data as telling a human story. And when I read reports of, the toll of air pollution on public health, or about the effect of marine heat waves on ocean life, or on pick your climate event, I see them as narrative dramas that have, in some cases, direct human scale, and in other cases, relevance for humans and the humanities. But yeah, I think that trying to plot the way and describe and interrogate the way that all of us are responding to a slow-moving ecological crisis which encloses us all is, that's the main job I see for myself in writing about climate now. There is news from climate science, there is news from climate politics and climate geopolitics, but fundamentally, I think what I'm doing is trying to chart and plot the way that all of us are making sense of this hard to process story, which we're all living through, and pointing out continuities with the past and discontinuities, pointing out, new cultural ideas and memes as they arise, and helping readers think through the dilemma, challenge that every one of us feels waking up in the morning to a whole new world in which the climate conditions which govern for all of human history are no longer relevant. And it's a harsh morning to wake up and to think about that. And it's what all of us are doing to some degree every day. Certainly when we turn on the news or, check on social media and our, if your feeds are anything like mine, there's just a ton of footage of disaster. And reckoning with that is, I think, one of the challenges of being alive in the 21st century. And I think one of my jobs is describing that struggle, and also, to some extent, to the extent that I can, helping readers see their way through it a little more clearly.
I think, if I could compliment you, you do that really well. That's a hard line to walk. I've taught a seminar on affect theory and ecological grief. And one of the things that comes up in that class is just the weight of really thinking about what's going on with the planet. Not just in the sense that the complexity of it and the dynamism of it are hyper objects that you just can't get your head fully around at once. It's just too big to conceive in full. But in the sense that if you really give it your attention, it's devastating. It's really heavy. And there are times when your book feels really heavy, but you do, I think, a remarkable job of pulling us back and saying, but we got us into this, we can get us out of this. There's a point where this kind of stood out for me that it's more than halfway through the book. It's on page 152 exactly. So it's like, it's a ways in. You break the fourth wall and address the reader directly. You say, if you have made it this far, you are a brave reader. And that felt like a brave thing to say. It almost felt like a kind of intimacy, really, because it's a way of acknowledging the heaviness, the sadness of the things you're talking about. And I really appreciated that gesture in the book. But I want to ask maybe an odd question, but it's given the gravity of your subject, in what ways, if any, do you consider the reader's feelings when you write, instead of making appeals to sort of their interests or intellect?
Well, I come at this subject from a background and a training as a journalist, and so my main impulse is really to tell the truth as I see it. And I have given some thought to the way that my work, the sort of strategic considerations of how my work might affect the climate movement and climate causes, and I've given some thought to the way that it will make people feel. But my main guiding light is just to describe the story as I see it unfolding. And one reason why I feel that way is not just, I don't want to sound like holier than thou or purer than thou, like journalists are often getting on their high horse about truth and stuff. And I think that's typically pretty self-serving and deluded. But and I don't want to run that line up the flagpole here. What I will say is that I don't feel qualified to prescribe a feeling. I don't feel qualified to say to you or any of you in this room or anybody reading my work, you should feel X way about Y story. In part because I feel different ways about the story day to day and hour to hour. I just published today a long story about the fires in Canada, these totally off the charts historic fires in Canada. And, it is horrifying in a lot of ways. The scale of that damage, wall to wall, like across the country burning, record breaking many times over. But there's also just I feel awe about it, that there's so much forest in Canada, that many million acres could burn. I feel impressed by the emergency response, such that even in total chaos, when things were completely mismanaged, there was no messaging going out, still this country, this vast country, totally beset by fire, managed to evacuate all of these communities all across the country without a single civilian dying in the flames. I feel wonder about what might replace or supplant the boreal forest, which has stood in northern Canada since the end of the last ice age. I was amused by the irony that a lot of people I met in northern Canada used in telling their stories about their encounters with fire. These are all really divergent feelings about a single story. And just as a reader, I wouldn't want someone to feel like, who was telling me that story, to say to me, this is the way you have to understand these fires. This is the way you have to feel about them. And it's the only legitimate approach. It's the only legitimate perspective. And so I try to not do that myself. To some degree, you can't avoid it when you're writing. You're choosing anecdotes. You're choosing things to emphasize. Of course, you're like curating an experience for readers. But what I hope to do in all of this writing is to give people the information and the space to respond to those stories, to this story, to this overwhelming story, however they're so inclined. And so that, I think somebody could read my book and, be so moved by the tragedy of a particular ecosystem or a particular animal species. And someone else could read my book and say the exact passage that you called out as being a little like tonally off or whatever, and respond to that and be like, you know what, fuck the animals, we gotta save the humans in this. And people could get angry about capitalism and what the book says about how capitalism has contributed to the crisis. And they could say, you know what, I think capitalism is going to get us out of this crisis. And all of those things are like fair. And I think, just as a sort of abstract principle, I want to enable as much complexity of response as possible, as opposed to narrow casting or, editing down what I think I've seen in order to produce a particular response. I just think we're too complex, the story's too complex to conceptualize in that way, and it's patronizing to readers to presume that I should be able to tell them what to think.
I think that's a really generous way to approach writing and just thinking in general, is meeting people. You don't know where all your readers are all at. You like to meet people you meet face to face where they're at, but sometimes you just don't know. So,
and they're in different places at different times. Like,
yeah,
I mean, somebody at 8 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon, they could be in a totally different mood,
Yeah.
about climate. I mean, that's how crazy it is.
Yeah, the questions I was going to ask you this morning are different than the ones I want to ask you now, because I've seen a couple of your conversations. I guess one of the things I would ask you next is, a number of times in the books you point to these incredible improvements that humans as a species have made to conditions of livability, to health, to lifespan, to rights, all kinds of wonderful improvements in relatively short span of time, and not just for the 1%, right? It hasn't benefited the people that already have privilege. I mean, it's certainly done a lot of that, but it's also benefited people who need help the most in certain ways. I wonder if there's a sense, though, where some of the gains that we've achieved have sort of come at the expense of almost baked-in problems, in the sense of, I guess what I'm trying to ask is whether some of our imaginable solutions to these scenarios might entrench the sort of problems they're trying to address.
Yeah, I think the short answer is yes. If we are, as we are now, embarking on a global program of decarbonization powered by asset manager capitalism and the hugely disproportionate power of financial institutions, that decarbonization program is going to take a particular shape. And if we had undertaken one that was much more directed by public investment, public policy, that would be a different kind of a shape. It would take a different shape if our transformations were managed somehow at a more local and community-based, level, with different value. I mean, all of these things are, all of the different paths that are before us pull us towards different futures, and some of those are going to, maybe the ones that we're on, are going to entrench the interests that have, to some degree, got us into this mess in the first place. So, what's the role of Saudi Aramco in a world where, the US and Europe has basically abandoned the production of fossil fuels? If you imagine such a world, we're not in that world actually, but if you imagine such a world, it could actually be hugely profitable and power granting to the remaining fossil fuel entities in the world, because there are going to be a lot of people out there who still want fossil fuels, and they're not. All that money is being made by a few remaining companies. What is the role of what's the role of the U.S. in the geopolitical landscape if the U.S. is as it is, like producing more oil than any other country in the world today? We're trying to bring about a renewable revolution, but we're still making a mess with things on the other side. It's all pretty tangled and uncomfortable and ugly. And I think one way of big picture framing the state of the climate crisis is to say we're past the point of perfect solutions. It's too late for that. We don't have time. We got to move with the institutions we have. We want to reform them and remodel them, but we want to wait 20 years to get started because first we have to deal with all these other problems. I think we're going to end up on the losing side of the climate fight. And maybe that's a little glib or a little simplistic, but I think in almost every way what we're dealing with is choices with trade-offs, and that's the place we've put ourselves by failing to act for as long as we've acted. And just to put some numbers on that, I mean, if we, as a planet, started decarbonizing the year that Al Gore won more votes for president than George W. Bush, year 2000, we would have had to decarbonize, we would have had to cut our emissions by about 1% per year to stay safely below the 1.5 degree threshold. And we could have taken 125 years to get to zero. Now in 2023, to stay safely, I think basically we can't do it. But if we drew a line that would allow us to stay below 1.5 degrees, it would mean completely eliminating all carbon emissions in the next 2 years. So that's the cost of delay. We're now dealing with a world that is transformed much more significantly by climate impacts than the one that we would have if we had started much earlier. And in part as a result, every choice we make involves really dramatic and significant trade-offs. And that's, bad news, but it's the world that we're living in.
That makes me want to ask you a question about growth, which is often connected to speed. Like, how can we raise capital or grow whatever we want quickly so that we can use it for whatever we need right away? And there's a few times in the book where you talk about growth of population, of the economy, and so forth. You cite Thomas Malthus and Paul Ehrlich, I gotta say that name, about this. And I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit more about growth itself as a value. It seems to have become almost a tacit value in the world today that's unexamined, that we should grow. And
maybe not so tacit, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, here at the university, we're being pushed to have 40,000 students. And I realize that growth isn't the same in all contexts, right? Some forms of growth are going to be more amenable to survivability and sustainability and so forth than others. But a lot of the problems that we are in can be charted on a directly corresponding with industrial growth and growth of the economy, are basically the same graph. So what does growth look like in the future?
Well, I mean, I would sort of first backtrack a little, and it connects to some of the things you were saying a few minutes ago about all of the measurable progress that the world has made over the course of the same period of time that we call industrial capitalism, we could call fossil capitalism. All of this period of time that we've been doing damage to the world's climate, we've also done, we've extended quite a lot of benefit to especially the world's poor. And that is I think it's a true statement to say, like, the world is richer than it's ever been. There are fewer people in poverty than there have ever been before. We're living longer, maternal mortality is down, infant mortality is down, educational achievement is up. Those things are all true, but it also tells a really simplistic narrative about the relationship between all these dynamics. And I think that there is I would say not just a tacit conviction, but sort of a committed, vocal, almost like ideological contingent in our discourse that's like, we owe everything to growth, and if we put a stop on growth, like everything will go to shit. And, I think that there are things that, would be better if we were richer and had more advanced technology. I think that's true. But I think just to like so casually equate some very crude measure of global GDP or whatever with all of these measures of well-being, I think is really, really misleading in a number of different ways. But one of them is like, the market liberal capitalist triumphalist story that people tell about growth is like, extreme poverty has fallen by 75% over the last 4 decades or whatever. And first of all, like that extreme poverty is like, it's measured, it's like $2 a day. So like you get from like $1.50 a day to $2.50 a day, and like we're counting that as like a giant triumph. The lion's share of the economic growth over that period has actually been among the world's wealthy. It has extended some benefits to the world's poor, but we're talking about really, really objectively small gains in absolute terms. And depending on how you want to tabulate those gains, like I think there's reasonable estimates that 70+% of that poverty reduction over that period took place in China, where they pulled 800 million people out of poverty over the last few decades. And that, just even knowing that fact, complicates our reflexive American or European narratives about growth and the way that it benefits the world for 2 big reasons. The first is like China's not an open market capitalist system. So if we're attributing the reduction of poverty, if we're celebrating the reduction of poverty, like we're kind of celebrating the work of a command and control state capitalist system, not the free market. And second of all, it paints the gains of the rest of the world in a much more unflattering light, where we've seen essentially no welfare gains in sub-Saharan Africa over the last half century, some gains, but much smaller than in China across South Asia. And we should think in more local, focused ways about exactly what's working and exactly what's not to make people's lives better, rather than just saying like, well, GDP is going up and therefore poverty is going down and it's all great. When we look at the US in particular, we see a lot of reasons to think that economic growth alone is not satisfying our basic needs. And by that I mean that we're dying younger than our counterparts, we're overdosing on drugs way more, we have a dysfunctional political society in many ways, people are frustrated and disappointed, few of them have an optimistic view of the future on either side of the aisle or in almost any walk of life. And it's really hard to look at that and say, well, like, oh, economic growth is like the silver bullet that's going to like solve everything, because the US has been growing much faster than any other mature economy in the world for decades now, and we're actually struggling a lot more than most of them along all of these other metrics. So I think at a very basic level, the crude measures that we have of human well-being that are based in simplistic models of economic growth are really misleading. But I do think that like we need change in a very profound way to allow us to redesign our future so that we are living healthier and greener and cleaner. And a lot of that is growth. I mean, it's like if we rebuild America's electricity grid so that we're not wasting 2/3 of our power to waste heat, and we're not limited in how much renewable capacity we can put on that grid, that's like, that's growth, that's like activity. It'll disrupt lands, it'll disrupt ecosystems. People object to the land use issues, but it's like progress in that conventional, basic, capitalist triumphalist worldview. We're building out our solar farms. We're building out, all of those things are like, this is industrial activity, which will amount to a continued transformation of the landscape to allow us to live, one hopes, in a more stable and balanced way in the future. Now, as I mentioned in the lecture briefly, it's also possible to view those transformations and that activity, that growth, from a different perspective and say, okay, well, if we replace oil and gas with solar and wind, actually we downsize our land use requirements, we downsize our mining requirements. This is not just additional disruption to the world's ecosystems we're undertaking. We're actually like reducing our footprint on the world by doing so. So it's all complicated and tangled, but I don't think we can, personally, I don't think we can imagine a world of net zero in which, in particular, the human needs of the 700, 800 million people in sub-Saharan Africa who don't even have access to electricity now are thriving without some amount of pretty dramatic industrial build-out over the course of the next few decades. And whether we want to think of that in terms of growth, or whether we want to think of it, whether we want to, modify or revise what we think of as growth, those are open questions. But I think we need like action, not just retreat. And that means I'm hopeful that what we'll see over the next few decades is a transformation of the world's industry and power systems and transportation systems and agriculture, and infrastructure that will allow us to be carbon neutral and stable. But I suspect, to the point you were raising a few minutes ago, there are going to be a lot of ways in which those ideals are disappointed and frustrated, even if we very rapidly get there. There's going to be a lot of exploitation and abuse. There will continue to be a lot of inequality globally and within countries. And these are all issues we should be thinking about and focusing on alongside the speed. But we do need the speed too.
I want to respect everyone's time. I think we're scheduled till 4:30, but if I can ask one more question.
Yeah, of course.
I want to end on or by going back to the question of feelings that I raised a little earlier. So and specifically the feeling that comes up in this book, it came up in the way you closed that statement right there. You feel hopeful. This feeling of hope. Hope is a really complicated feeling because it can be a palliative that makes us complacent and makes us think everything's okay and it's a problem that's away from me and I'm not complicit in it, or a way to sort of help us gloss over the difficult reality that things are really bad because it's harder to face that. At the same time, we need hope to imagine a future that's livable and that involves flourishing, where people are being treated humanely and we have reason to sort of carry on. So I don't know, maybe I'm hoping you can leave the audiences here with some thoughts on how to navigate that balance or that tension, I guess is a better word, and perhaps a question you must have been asked a bunch of times, the what can I do question, because we don't all have the platform that you have. And I'm guessing many of us would like to do what we can, but given the scale of the problem at an individual level, it's very hard for us to feel like we can do a whole lot.
Yeah, I mean, hope is tricky for me. I mean, I think personally I start more from a place of responsibility and an understanding that, as I said, the new line of the Young Readers Edition is like, the world will be what we make it. How you process that fact probably says more about your temperamental inclinations than it does about actually the state of the climate or what needs to be done. And whether you think we're capable of reform or renovation or revolution on those points, again, is like less about the state of the world and more about the state of your psyche. But I do think that at a fundamental level, it is true that while we have missed the opportunity to secure a climate that resembles the one that all of our ancestors grew up in, we are still looking at a future that we can build for ourselves and each other. And we can build a future that is more equitable, more just, more prosperous, more safe, more stable, or we can build a future that is less all of those things. And whether we end up towards one of those poles or the other will be determined to some meaningful degree by how much warming we allow. But it'll also be determined, I think, probably to a more significant degree about the institutions we build and the systems of sort of, community support and concern that we structure into the fabric of our societies. And, there are reasons to think that we're going to do well on those metrics, and there are reasons to think that we may not. But ultimately, it's an unwritten story, and we're here as its authors. So we shouldn't, if we can manage to, not feel overwhelmed by the responsibility of the task, but feel empowered by it. Literally, the future of the world and the future of humanity is in the hands of a single generation, which is a story that we used to talk about in mythology and religion, not history. And here we are in history with the same scale of responsibility. What that means for individuals depends a lot on who you are and what you're inclined to do and what you feel your special skill set is. And everybody's going to answer the call of responsibility differently. And again, I wouldn't presume to tell people to do any one thing or any one other thing. In managing one's own carbon footprint, I mean, it's pretty simple. Like, you want to eat less or no red meat. You want to drive an electric car if you can afford it, and you want to not fly if you can manage not flying. Those things aren't going to solve the climate crisis, even if 330 million Americans do it, and even if 8 billion people on the planet do it. But if you want to manage your own carbon footprint, that's like the basic toolkit. But beyond that, we're in a struggle to redesign almost every aspect of the modern systems of our lives. And in order to effectuate that change and fundamentally remove carbon from those systems requires politics and large-scale action. And that means, for me, the main thing that individuals can do is to try to raise awareness, mobilize, engage publicly, and put pressure on the people who are in positions of power to really meaningfully not just commit rhetorically to climate action, but to fulfill those promises when they have the opportunity to, rather than shying away from them or diminishing them once in office. And that's a really large ask. Protests often don't work out, don't find the end result that they want. And even when progress is made, people who are engaged in political activism often feel like they lost because they didn't get all the way to where they wanted to go. But I think about the progress that we've made at the level of discourse, at the level of political rhetoric, at the level of policy, and at the level of emissions just over the last 5 years since I really started working on this. And I am in awe of what a different world we're living in already than we were just 5 years ago. 5 years ago, we had never heard of Greta. There's not a new generation doing climate strikes all around the world. Political leaders were still engaged in climate denial. Corporate actors were not making meaningful net zero commitments. The investment in renewables that we've seen over the last few years was just a fraction of what it's now. And for all of those reasons, you could look at the state of the world back then and say, well, we've been reckoning and with climate change and thinking about it for 30 years, and not much has changed. The emissions are just going up. And 5 years later, we're in a really quite different place because many more people at all levels of power and in all parts of the world decided that they weren't going to sit back as passive observers, but make their voices heard and their demands known. And I find that especially inspiring because many of those most vocal people were young, not of voting age, many of them not living in democracies, many of them, young women in patriarchal societies, LGBTQ youth in repressive societies. And they were like, no, we're gonna strike. We're gonna go out on climate strike, and we're gonna demand that the world pay attention to us, even though we are as far from the halls of power as anyone on this planet is. And they did that, and it worked. Like, people listened, the policies moved, not fast enough, but much more than has ever happened before. And I think that is inspiring on many different levels, on an individual, personal level, but also in terms of what it means for the future, which is to say something that seemed impossible, that we could cut our expected warming in half in 5 years. we did. And that means that things that now seem impossible no longer need to seem impossible 5 years from now or 10 years from now if we take the right actions today. And so overall, what I would say, my message, my takeaway, I'm not an activist, I'm not a, this isn't how I think of it, it's really just how I see the story unfolding, is that the conditions of the future, which seem unmovable now, will be moved over the next decade. The question is where we move them and how quickly, and ultimately that will be determined by how many people like us wake up and demand that we do so. So it's an open question, but an open question means you can answer the call, no matter who you are, and help shape literally the future of the planet, which is pretty amazing and inspiring, just from a storytelling perspective, let alone a political perspective. And unfortunately, we've waited long enough that we're not going to be able to declare victory and say, wow, it's like we did with the ozone. Oh, we solved that problem. It's over. It's behind us. We're going to be living with climate change for the rest of our lives. But we can really change how much of it and how bad it gets based on what we do now and in the years and decades ahead. So I hope that sounds like an empowering message. It feels that way to me. This is not a story that's happening outside of us. It is happening in this generation right now, and it is in the control of humans. And while political power feels distant, it is still human power, and we have the power as individuals to change that course.
I love that. Thank you. Please join me in thanking David Wallace for joining us.